Hey, welcome back to Music Class, kids. Today, we're going to talk about one of the greatest and most influential bands in history. And if you couldn't guess by the poster behind me, we're talking about the Beatles. What a funny name. Well, they were a pretty fun group, actually. And the members of the Beatles are George Harrison, he played guitar. Paul McCartney, he sang and played the bass. Ringo Starr played the drums. And John Lennon also played guitar, sang, and wrote a lot of the songs too. So whatever music you like to listen to today, well, the Beatles paved the way for a lot of the music that we like to listen to today. So we're going to learn about them. And today I'm going to read you a little book called The Beatles, and is written and illustrated by Mike Venezia. So let's get started, and we'll find out a little bit more about who the Beatles were today. Okay. From about 1964 to 1970, the Beatles were the world's most popular musical group. The Beatles were four musicians from Liverpool, England. They were John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. None of them had any real music lessons. They pretty much taught themselves as they went along. In the 1950s, when John, Paul, George, and Ringo were growing up, Liverpool was a poor, gloomy seaport city. One good thing going on there was that local sailors returning home from their journeys brought back rock and roll records from the United States. People who lived in Liverpool became the first people in England to hear the exciting new music. Rock and roll grew out of a bunch of different American musical styles, including country western and African American rhythm and blues. Rock and roll had a lot more energy though, and a wilder sound. The favorite instruments of rock and roll groups were guitars, drums, and sometimes pianos and saxophones. Long before the Beatles met, each of them was inspired by rock and roll music. They were crazy about singers like Buddy Holly, Bill Haley and the Comets, Little Richard, the Everly Brothers, Chuck Berry, Jerry Lee Lewis, and especially Elvis Presley. Here's a couple of them right here. Here's Chuck Berry, Buddy Holly, Little Richard, and Jerry Lee Lewis. Bill Haley and the Comets is on this side. This guy's playing his bass upside down. How crazy is that? Okay, in this page it says, it wasn't just the music itself that John, Paul, George, and Ringo loved. The words of rock and roll songs made them feel good too. Teenagers everywhere thought that rock singers understood them and had the same kinds of problems as they did. Yeah. Kind of like some of the musicians and singers you like to listen to today on the radio. And here's Elvis Presley. He really could dance. John Lennon started the Beatles. He was born in 1940 during a World War II bombing raid. John's father left his family when John was only 5 years old. John's mother, Julia, felt her son would be better off being raised by his aunt and uncle. John's mother stayed close to him while he was growing up, though. She helped him get his first guitar. Since Julia knew how to play the banjo, she was able to teach John to play his guitar a little. John Lennon was known as a troublemaker in school. He was always getting into fights and arguments. John was smart, but he never got very good grades. Later, John went to art college. He was a talented artist, but was really much more interested in playing his guitar and singing. John and his friends would practice their music in empty classrooms during lunchtime and after school. This was the beginning of John Lennon's band, which he called the Quarrymen. Here's a picture of them right there, long ago. Paul McCartney was 2 years younger than John Lennon. Even though music was always around Paul's home while he was growing up, he wasn't very interested in it until he became a teenager. Paul's father led a small dance band and played the piano. He also rigged up a set of radio receivers for Paul and his younger brother. Paul heard his first rock and roll songs broadcast from far away as he laid in his bed late at night. When Paul was 14, he started picking out his favorite tunes on the piano. He was pretty good at this and soon was anxious to get a guitar. Once he got his guitar, it seemed like it was all he cared about. Paul practiced in any room he could find, even the bathroom. He's playing the guitar in the tub. One day, Paul heard a local band playing at a church picnic. The band happened to be the Quarrymen. Paul thought John Lennon was pretty cool. He noticed that when John forgot the words to a song, he would just make up his own words. Later that day, Paul met John and played guitar for him. Paul imitated some famous rock and roll singers perfectly. John thought Paul was pretty cool too and asked him to join the Quarrymen. George Harrison was the youngest Beatle. He was born in 1943. Of all the Beatles, George was the one whose parents were the most encouraging when he got his first guitar. George started out by teaching himself to play. He often became discouraged and almost gave up. Fortunately, his mother told him he would get it if he kept trying. By the time George was 14 years old, he could play really well. George happened to go to the same school as Paul McCartney. In fact, George's father drove the bus that took the boys there. George and Paul became good friends. They practiced their guitars at each other's houses. Paul introduced George to John Lennon. At first, John thought George was just a kid and too young to pay any attention to. But George had become good enough to get some jobs playing on his own. He kept hanging around the Quarrymen, hoping to become a member. One day, George played a rock and roll song that was one of John's favorites. John was so impressed that he said George could finally join the band. Now, there were 3 members of the Quarrymen, who would soon become known as the Beatles. The last member to join the Beatles was their drummer, Ringo Starr. Ringo's real name was Richard Starkey. He changed his name because he thought it sounded better for someone in show business. Plus, he always wore lots of rings. Ringo had a pretty hard time growing up. He was born in 1940 and came from one of the roughest, toughest parts of Liverpool. When Ringo was 6 years old, he had a serious attack of appendicitis. Then, Ringo had some other illnesses that kept him in and out of the hospital until he was almost 15 years old. He fell way behind in school and had a very hard time catching up. Sometimes Ringo would play in the hospital band, but only when they let him play the drum. As a teenager, he became even more interested in playing the drums and bought a set. And there he is playing the drum in the hospital, driving everybody crazy. Ringo helped start a band that played mostly for the fun of it. Later, he joined a band that became very popular in Liverpool. Ringo's new band would usually play in the same places as John Lennon's band, which was now called the Beatles. The Beatles had a drummer, but John, Paul, and George weren't crazy about him. Sometimes when their drummer didn't show up, the Beatles would ask Ringo to sit in with them. John, Paul, and George got along great with Ringo and finally asked him to become their regular drummer. Now, the Beatles had everyone they needed to make a great rock and roll band. John played rhythm guitar, Paul played bass guitar, George played lead guitar, and Ringo played the drums. Just before Ringo joined the Beatles, they had been having some luck playing in small clubs in Liverpool and in Hamburg, Germany. These clubs were dark and dank, and sometimes were filled with creepy customers. The Beatles had to sing for hours at a time, late into the night. To keep themselves from getting worn out, the Beatles ate and drank right on the stage. They often told jokes to each other, and even yelled rude things at their audience. They were having a great time singing songs they had written and goofing around, and their fans loved it. Suddenly, the Beatles were becoming a big hit around Liverpool. Now, what they needed was a way to become better known outside of their hometown. Luckily, a businessman named Brian Epstein came along at this time. Brian ran a record store down the street from where the Beatles were playing in Liverpool. One day, he heard the Beatles and thought they were great. Brian met with John, Paul, George, and Ringo. He convinced them that he could get their songs recorded by a big record company. He also said he would set up concerts and would try to get the Beatles on radio and TV shows. The only thing Brian asked of the Beatles was to stop goofing around on stage so much and to dress a little more neatly. Brian Epstein worked as hard as he could to keep his promise. Before they knew it, the Beatles were playing their music all over England. They even played for the Queen of England. Fans loved the way the Beatles shook their floppy hair around and sang their famous high-pitched ooh. Sometimes it caused some of their fans to faint. They were so excited. Here's some of the police holding back some of the crazy fans trying to see the Beatles. On this page it says, the cheery, yeah, 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 you can hear in their song She Loves You, helped make it the Beatles' first million-selling record. The Beatles were more popular than ever in England and the rest of Europe. There was one place, though, where the Beatles wanted to become better known. Can you guess where that was? John, Paul, George, and Ringo really wanted their music to become popular in the United States, the country where rock and roll began. Brian went to work again. He talked to a famous television show host in America and arranged for the Beatles to appear on his show. And here he is. This is Ed Sullivan, way, way back in time, and there are the Beatles, the first time on TV. On this page, it says, on the night the Beatles appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, it seemed like everyone in the United States was tuned in. The Beatles were a huge hit. The only problem was that the fans in the audience were screaming so loud with excitement that people could hardly hear the Beatles sing. Now the Beatles were the most popular singing group ever. They began touring all over the world. Traveling ended up becoming a big problem for the Beatles. Fans kept screaming so much that even the Beatles could hardly hear themselves sing. They always had to rush to and from their hotel rooms so they wouldn't get mobbed. Fans were everywhere. Also, traveling to so many cities all the time started making the Beatles cranky. Finally, they decided to stop traveling and spend more time making records. This is when the Beatles' music started to change in an important way. In the recording studio, the Beatles discovered and experimented with new sounds that had never been heard before. They used the recording studio kind of like an electronic instrument and created some of the most exciting music ever. The Beatles tried things like putting echoes on their voices and recording their voices at different speeds. They experimented with the music of India and other cultures. They tried all kinds of different instruments too. They brought in musicians from important symphony orchestras and sometimes recorded things backwards. Their music had a huge influence on many rock composers who came after them. In one of their greatest albums, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, you can hear all kinds of wonderful sounds and lyrics the Beatles invented. For the ending of a song called A Day in the Life, the Beatles made a piano chord last for 40 seconds. It sounds spectacular. By the time the band broke up in 1970, many people thought the Beatles had done something no other popular band had done. They had made popular rock and roll music as important as classical or symphonic music. In the 1970s, when the Beatles split up, it was just because they each wanted to try doing their own music. They were all very successful. Paul started a new group called Wings. George and Ringo recorded their own music and gave concerts. John wrote music with his wife, Yoko Ono. And today, it's easier than ever to hear the Beatles' music. Their record albums have been re-recorded onto compact discs and tapes, and their music is on the radio all the time. So you can look them up and listen to any of the songs you'd like. So I hope you enjoyed learning about the Beatles today, and we'll see you next time.